It's Friday, October the 28th, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to our weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, Rishi Sunak takes up the reins of power after the short-lived government of Liz Truss, but the tough question started straight away.
Was his Home Secretary right to resign last week for a breach of security?
She made an error of judgment, but she recognised that, she raised the matter and she accepted her mistake.
20 years on from the hunting ban in Scotland, MSPs are revisiting it with new legislation. And there have been questions about the remaining roles of Prince Andrew and Prince Harry. Should they still be allowed to stand in for the King? Well, once again, it's been a very busy week in British politics, and that's an understatement. Our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume, is here to guide us through it. Susan, the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, only took office on Tuesday, and the next day it was Prime Minister's questions, and he was facing Keir Starmer at the dispatch box. How did their first encounter go?
Well, yes, Prime Minister's questions. It's been a busy week every week, I think, for weeks and months. Yeah. We seem to say that at the start of every one of these programmes, don't we, Joe?
Yeah.
But it's true. And in fact, I think Conservative MPs are hoping Rishi Sunak will be the end of some of that excitement and we'll have a bit of calm and stability. Because let's think about it. We've actually had 3 different Prime Ministers answering Prime Minister's question time in just the last 5 sessions. So Conservative MPs gave a really rapturous welcome to Rishi Sunak. Not, though, that he doesn't have some hard questions to answer himself, some, quite difficult decisions ahead, obviously on the economy, but also hard questions on some decisions he'd already made just in a few hours, particularly over his new cabinet, particularly over the reappointment of Suella Braverman as Home Secretary. You recall she'd had to resign just 6 days beforehand over a security breach. Now, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, had said you only appointed her because she could bring you in votes in that leadership contest from her wing of the party. However, he did start off by being nice to Rishi Sunak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I welcome the Prime Minister. The first British Asian Prime Minister is a significant moment in our national story. And it's a reminder that for all the challenges we face as a country, Britain is a place where people of all races and all beliefs can fulfil their dreams. That's not true in every country, and many didn't think that they would live to see the day when it would be true here. It's part of what makes us all so proud to be British. Was his Home Secretary right to resign last week for a breach of security?
Prime Minister! Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Ronald gentleman for his kind and indeed generous welcome to the dispatch box. I look forward to Prime Minister's question time with him, and I know that we will have, no doubt, robust exchanges, but I hope that they can also be serious and grown up. So I look forward to it. Well, he asked about the Home Secretary. The Home Secretary made an error of judgment, but she recognised that, she raised the matter, and she accepted her mistake. And that's why I was delighted to welcome back into a united cabinet that brings experience and stability to the heart of government.
We can all see what's happened here. He's so weak, he's done a grubby deal, trading national security because he was scared to lose another leadership election. There's a new Tory at the top, but as always with them, party first, country second. Yesterday, on the steps of Downing Street, he also admitted what the whole country knows. The Tories have crashed the economy and now somebody has to pay for their mess. I say it shouldn't be working people who've been hammered time and again by this lot. but those with the broadest shoulders must step up. Does he agree?
No. Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman talked about party first and country second. Perhaps he could explain to us why it was a few years ago he was supporting the member for Islington North. My record is clear. When times are difficult in this country, I will always protect the most vulnerable. That is the values of our compassionate party. We did it in COVID and we will do that again.
He pretends he's on the side of working people, but in private he says something very different. Over the summer, he was secretly recorded at a garden party in Tunbridge Wells, boasting to a group of Tory members that he personally moved money away from deprived areas to wealthy places instead. Rather than apologise or pretend that he meant something else, why doesn't he now do the right thing and undo the changes that he made to those funding formulas?
I know the right honourable gentleman rarely leaves North London. But if he does, he will know that there are deprived areas in our rural communities, in our coastal communities, and across the south, and this government will relentlessly support them, because we are a government that will deliver for people across the United Kingdom.
I think everyone should watch the video and make their own minds up. In public, he claims he wants to level up the north. But then he boasts about trying to funnel vital investment away from deprived areas. He says one thing and does another. But they're shouting. They're not my words. They're not my words. They're the words of the former chair of the Tory party, sacked yesterday for telling the truth about the Prime Minister. Even his own side know he's not on the side of working people. That's why the only time he ran in a competitive election, he got trounced by the former Prime Minister, who herself got beaten by a lettuce. So why doesn't he put it to the test, let working people have their say and call a general election?
He talks about mandates, about votes, about elections. It's a bit rich coming from the person who tried to overturn the biggest democratic vote in our country's history. Our mandate is based on a manifesto that we were elected on, to remind him an election that we won and they lost. A mandate that says we want a stronger NHS, better schools, safer streets, control of our borders and levelling up. That is the mandate that I and this government will deliver for the British people.
Rishi Sunak's first Prime Minister's questions. Thanks, Susan. I'll come back to you shortly for more from Westminster. Now, Edinburgh, to our Scotland political reporter, Jenny Davidson. Jenny, at First Minister's questions this week, Nicola Sturgeon was challenged on whether an independent Scotland would have to join the euro. What was her answer?
Well, she was saying no, referring to countries such as Sweden that have been in the EU for a long time and not joined the euro. This all comes on the back of an article published in The Times this week, quoting a number of senior EU sources saying that if an independent Scotland wanted to join the EU, it would need to commit to joining the euro, whereas a recent policy paper published by the Scottish Government a couple of weeks ago on currency in an independent Scotland says that Scotland would initially continue to use the UK pound before setting up its own currency rather than joining the euro. And Deputy First Minister John Swinney has indicated that he'd expect an independent Scotland to join the EU within about a decade of becoming independent. But as we'll see, currency issues are also a risky area for the Conservatives to touch on right now.
Let's run through the facts on Nicola Sturgeon's flimsy plan. The First Minister has no idea how to tackle the deficit. Not a word on all of the taxes she will have to rise. Silent on the public services that will be cut. And she wants to separate Scotland from our biggest trading partner, bringing in her own words, a hard border, risking 500,000 Scottish jobs that depend on UK trade, abandon the pound, has no plan to pay for pensions and no security for people's mortgages. So let me ask the First Minister this. Why? Why? Oh, why
All voices should be heard in this chamber. I'm sure we would all wish to afford one another that courtesy. Please continue.
So with your flimsy plan and the disaster it's going to create for Scotland, why, oh why, do you insist on dragging our country through this when you should be uniting us to deal with the challenges our country faces?
Douglas Ross is from the party that over recent times has wrecked the pound. He talks about, and he has the nerve to stand up in this chamber and talk about security for mortgage payers, from the party that over recent weeks brought mortgage funds to security for pensions, that brought pension funds within hours of collapse. He calls on security for mortgage payers, the party that, because of its incompetence, has sent mortgage rates soaring through the roof. That is the reality of Scotland within the United Kingdom.
And Nicola Sturgeon went on to say that Douglas Ross also had a nerve to talk about deficits. She said that deficits right now are caused by decisions at Westminster, and she said we're going to find out later in November the price Scotland is going to have to pay in the form of another wave of Tory austerity.
On another subject, Jenny, the Scottish Government's planning to set up a national care service, but there are already questions being asked about the cost of setting it up, aren't there?
Indeed, so the idea is to set up a national care service to cover social care along the lines of the way that the NHS covers health on a national basis. But yes, outspoken criticisms on the Finance Committee this week about the lack of detail accompanying the bill to set up this service in terms of how much the cost would be of setting up such a body and how it would be of more benefit than simply giving the same amount of money to the existing frontline services. And unusually, among those critics were SNP MSPs. They tend to be quite loyal to party lines, even within committees. But we heard committee convener SNP MSP Kenny Gibson referring to the proposal as using a sledgehammer to crack a nut and talking about the bill as a monumental risk. And his colleague Michelle Thompson took a similar view.
And I did look in the financial memorandum specifically on the word risk, and the word risk is only mentioned twice there. But what this is screaming out to me is a huge risks. I feel as though, given whether you're under pressure of timescales to deliver on this, but at the moment from a financial scrutiny, I'm looking at a blank cheque for the public purse, and I find that deeply worrying. So have you been, if you'd had your choice, would you have produced that financial memorandum, or would you have wanted more detail and further breaking down based on the policy provisions? So will you push to bring that forward?
I think that it is the nature of the approach, because, as I've said, form does need to follow function, and we want to be really clear with people that what we're developing works for them. We've talked, we've talked a lot about the risks, and I can provide some real reassurance that as part of the programme work, the risks are very much at the front of our minds, whether those be delivery risks, financial risks, etc., etc. So we are absolutely aware and actively managing the risks associated with this programme.
And of course, this comes at a time when the Scottish Government is already facing a black hole in the Scottish budget due to the rate of inflation, and with a great deal of uncertainty over what money it actually will have, with possible changes coming in the autumn statement next month. So a difficult time to be considering a very expensive change without being completely certain of what it will cost.
Yeah, indeed. Finally, though, 20 years after hunting with dogs was banned in Scotland, why are MSPs discussing it again? What's the bone of contention, to coin a phrase?
Not so much contention, actually, as an agreement in principle. As you say, the 2002 Protection of Wild Mammals Act was meant to have outlawed fox hunting in Scotland already, but there have been concerns that it's been continuing illegally, and certain aspects of that act 20 years ago make it very difficult to pursue prosecutions against those who are continuing to hunt. So this new bill is aimed at replacing that one, of clarifying some terms, of tightening up loopholes, and just essentially making sure that the legislation does what it was originally meant to do. In fact, the Environment Minister, Mary McCallan, talked about having looked at this 2002 bill as a law student and been given it as an example of legislation that hadn't really worked. So she's now aiming to improve on that. General principles, as I say, broad agreement. It was passed at stage one with cross-party support, only one MSP voting against it. But as always, it's the detail that's the issue. There is a proposal for a licensing scheme for certain exceptions. Some MSPs believe that the licensing scheme is difficult and unworkable and will be problematic for some people, such as farmers, who actually will need exceptions. Others arguing that there should be no licensing scheme, there should be no exceptions, because that just puts loopholes back in.
This hunting with dogs bill is growing to a large pile of red tape, and it's stopping people from doing their job. The very people who provide food for the country whilst working towards a sustainable future for agriculture and for Scotland's countryside, protecting crops and managing our natural environment and protecting wildlife. These people are all doing this, but they're needlessly being penalised, presiding officer, with more bureaucracy than ever.
The bill does not fully close the loopholes that exist, it merely licenses them. And, presiding officer, you cannot licence cruelty. You cannot believe on the one hand that we need to limit the number of dogs to 2 because that reduces the risk of dogs instinctively chasing and killing, but then on the other hand continue to allow the use of packs of dogs simply because they have a licence. Presiding officer, you don't close loopholes by creating new ones.
Some have called for more liberal terms for the scheme to ensure that it will rise to what they see as an essential purpose, while others have called for no licensing scheme at all. Some members have been clear that the licensing scheme, in their view, is essential to operate effectively in certain circumstances. And what I would say to that is that the scheme is designed to operate on an extraordinary basis. Therefore, where it is truly essential, it will be available. Where it is not essential, where 2 dogs or another method of control would work, the licensing scheme will not be essential.
And just one interesting point in this is an exception to the agreement between the SNP and the Greens when they formed a government. The Greens, for the purposes of this, are going to be an opposition party, and they're promising, along with the other parties, to come along with amendments at stage 2.
Jenny Davidson at Holyrood, thank you very much. Now, the House of Commons heard a statement from Grant Shapps earlier in the week when he was Home Secretary about the findings of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. Now, this was, of course, before he was made Business Secretary under Rishi Sunak in the new Prime Minister's cabinet reshuffle. Susan, what did he have to say?
Well, Grant Shapps thanked the team behind the inquiry for what he said was their dedication to uncovering really generations of horrendous failings by society, by institutions and by professionals that had allowed this child abuse to take place. It was an inquiry set up under Theresa May when she was Home Secretary, and it took evidence from around 7,000 victims. It also said that a lot of the institutions had really prioritised their own reputations over the welfare of those that they were meant to be protecting. And it had suggested that people should be legally obliged to report child abuse where they found it. However, Grant Shapps couldn't actually commit to that one.
The report reveals horrific abuse of children. It makes for devastating and distressing reading. It finds that organisations have put their reputations ahead of protecting vulnerable children, either turning a blind eye or actively covering up abuse. And this is inexcusable. I'm a father of 3 children, and this report has made for very difficult reading. I cannot imagine the pain victims have been through. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I say this on behalf of the government and all governments that come before, to all the victims who have suffered this horrendous abuse, I am truly sorry.
This is a deeply serious report about one of the worst imaginable crimes, about the sexual abuse and exploitation of children. The violence and pain, the terror that they have described, the degradation and violation, and the consequences that they have felt throughout their lives. So I and my party join with the Home Secretary and the Government in their deep apology towards those who were so badly let down by state institutions who should have kept them safe. We are truly sorry. And the inquiry recommends major changes in child protection and in support for victims. The Home Secretary has rightly committed to oversee a radical improvement in how this crime is dealt with and prevented, and that is welcome. But I have stood at this dispatch box and heard similar promises before, and his response today is not strong enough and does not go far enough, because this is not just a historic inquiry. The report is clear that child sexual abuse is endemic and increasing, and there are children at risk today and basic child protection issues which are getting worse and need action now in advance of the government's full response to the inquiry.
This report has indeed shone a light on the horrific violence against children that has been taking place in the past, but also sadly takes place today as well. The government now has an opportunity on the back of this inquiry report to make changes that will make a real difference. So I urge my right honourable friend to make sure that all parts of government take this report and treat it with utter seriousness, and particularly the recommendation on mandatory reporting.
We can all agree that victims and survivors have waited far too long for this inquiry and for robust action to be taken against child sexual abuse, and we mustn't waste any more time. So I wanted to ask the Home Secretary whether he could commit within this session of Parliament to bring forward any legislative changes that need to be introduced, particularly around mandatory reporting.
There is an awful lot here that we need to look at, consider and come back to the House and report on. So I'd rather go through that process systematically to make sure that we get it right than make a promise from this dispatch box that I don't yet know that I would be able to fulfil. What I can reassure her and all members across the House is I will be doing that with the utmost speed and determination.
Grant Shapps, of course, no longer the Home Secretary. The Commons also debated an important bill, Susan, that would sweep away all remaining EU laws. Now, Brexit-related matters quite often cause a stir. Was this debate any exception?
Oh, no, it wasn't. Some of the old divisions were on display. Now, after Brexit, just to explain the background to this, the UK kept a lot of EU-derived laws that we'd been using and sort of wrote them into domestic law so that we could keep on using them. These were things covering things like consumer protection, the environment, workers' rights, that kind of thing. However, Jacob Rees-Mogg, as the Business Secretary and the Liz Truss government, had vowed to sweep all those away, saying that what we ought to have are sort of homegrown British laws to cover these areas. So they wanted in this bill to make sure that those laws just fall away in just over a year's time, unless it's been amended or replacements put in there for it. Of course, that's hugely controversial. Lots of groups say, whoa, if these laws just go pop at the end of next year and disappear, what are we going to do? We need some of this red tape, as you call it, but you actually need some of these laws to underpin what we're doing. Anyway, the first debate on the bill was scheduled this week. A couple of hours earlier, though, Jacob Rees-Mogg left the government. He'd been supposed to be opening the debate on the bill, but he left the government because Rishi Sunak was becoming Prime Minister. He was there for the debate, sitting up on the back benches again, and of course that did excite a little bit of comment.
I have the bill in front of me, and it says it's presented to the House by Mr Secretary Rees-Mogg. But the member for North East Somerset is sitting on the back benches of the House. Could you explain to the House how on earth we can possibly proceed with what was essentially a vanity project for that particular individual? Would it not be better that he tries his luck with a 10-minute rule bill or on the private member's bill ballot?
Individuals are transient. Government is permanent. Well, permanent during the space of one Parliament. And as we are in that same Parliament, the personal position of the honourable gentleman for Somerset is, I'm afraid, I'm sorry to tell him, irrelevant for the moment.
This bill is the culmination of the government's work to untangle the United Kingdom from nearly 50 years of EU membership. Through this bill, we will create a more agile and innovative regulatory environment that would have been possible, not have been possible, should we have been a member of the European Union still. This will benefit people and businesses across the United Kingdom.
How will he answer the intemperate correspondence to which many of us have been subjected, announcing that this bill will provide for the rape of the countryside and the destruction of wildlife? Will he be able to persuade them that this is a proportionate measure that will allow us to choose the regulations by which we wish to live and judge them on their merits?
The premise of this is to make sure that we are doing what we have always done, which is to have the best place in the world to live, and that includes our environment. And it's an absolute priority of this government that the United Kingdom will be the best place to start and grow a business, to live, and to ensure that our environment around us is supported at all times.
What is the justification for allowing ministers to scrap legislation that currently applies simply by doing nothing because of the sunset clause? I've never seen anything like it before. What is the justification for allowing law to fall away if ministers decide, well, I'm not going to address it at all?
In terms of the framework of this bill, there's a committee stage. The ability to have parliamentary scrutiny is huge. Now, I would make one other point, though. At what point were we able to scrutinise those laws when part of the EU? Because we were not. All of those laws were put in without scrutiny.
This bill asks the British public to place blind faith in the government, to trust them with our rights at work, our environmental protections, our legal rights. But why would we trust a government that's crashed our economy, that's driven up the cost of borrowing, that's dashed the hopes of homeowners across the country? Business likes certainty. And this bill throws thousands of pieces of legislation into the grinder with no idea which and how many of them will survive.
I would say that anybody who opposes the removal of the supremacy of EU law is fighting the Brexit battle over again. It is about saying that we didn't really leave after all. We'd like to pretend we're still there. And isn't it nice to allow this alien law to continue to tell us what we ought to do? No, Madam Deputy Speaker, it isn't nice to do that. Let us clarify the law. Let us get close to certainty as is humanly possible.
How do you convert literally hundreds of laws in the Department of Environment, Food and so on into British law within the timescale imagined? Does he understand the severe doubts that many people have about the practicality of what is on offer?
I'm afraid my honourable friend has never liked the decision to leave the European Union, and everything he says must be taken in that context.
On a very simple point of order, the right honourable gentleman just said that I never accepted the decision of this country to leave the European Union. That is a quite extraordinary and entirely untrue observation, and I would ask him to withdraw it.
Well, he certainly didn't withdraw it. He just sort of ignored it and swept on to the next thing.
Susan, thank you very much. We'll come back to you shortly. We're off to Cardiff and our Wales political reporter there, Teleri Glyn-Jones. Hello to you. Discussions this week have centred on relations with the UK government and climate change. What are the details?
So this week's FMQs was a lot less eventful than last week's, which saw Mark Drakeford's angry reactions go viral. Because on Tuesday this week, of course, was Rishi Sunak's first day in office, and the issues of intergovernmental relations did come up. Because it's fair to say over the last few years that they have been particularly strained, no more so than under Liz Truss, who famously didn't call the First Minister of Wales or Scotland at all, not once in her short tenure. So Adam Price, the leader of Plaid Cymru, suggested a change of tack.
You quite rightly complained that the last Tory Prime Minister failed to pick up the phone to you and indeed treated yours and the other devolved governments with contempt. How do you intend to approach relations with the latest Prime Minister? Will you perhaps decide to change tack and try and pick up the phone to him, as leaders of other national governments are set to do over the next few days?
You can be sure that I will want to have a constructive relationship with the new Prime Minister. And if I have an opportunity, there will be a series of things that I will want to put early on his list of priorities. The future of the United Kingdom itself. I'll remind him, no doubt, that the Welsh Government is the only other unambiguously unionist government with which he will have contact, and I would want to work with him to make sure that there is a successful future for the United Kingdom.
So Mark Drakeford actually didn't need to call the Prime Minister, because by the end of his first day in office, Rishi Sunak had called him. And he went on to tweet the Prime Minister, well, the Prime Minister went on to tweet saying it's the UK government's duty to work with the devolved government, something I don't think Liz Truss believed. So the mood music coming from both governments looks set to create hopefully a more constructive, or the Welsh Government will hope a more constructive, a more respectful and a positive relationship going forward.
Well, we shall see, won't we, Teleri? The Welsh Government has made an announcement on setting up a new publicly owned renewable energy company. Viewers may remember from the Labour Party conference a few weeks ago that that was a key policy there. Does it follow similar lines?
Yes, so, you know, actually a very big announcement, which probably didn't get its time in the sun because of the timing on Tuesday with the Prime Minister's first day in office. But other governments around the world, Germany, Sweden, have these state-owned energy companies. Some of them build wind farms in places like Wales. And although they create jobs here and some of the money goes towards local communities, most of the profits end up going back to the countries where these developers are based. And so the Welsh Government hopes to change that and to take, to ensure some of that, or to ensure the profits stay here in Wales and is ploughed back into local communities.
It's really good to see that you're going forward, in terms of looking at projects where we can actually help us towards our ambitions of carbon zero, as well as, putting more money back into the local economy.
Now, do you agree that certainly in terms of community energy projects that we need to act more urgently than that?
This is the announcement of us making a state-owned large-scale energy developer. So this is a scale hitherto unknown in the projects that are owned by communities across Wales. This is a major developer. That's why the returns will take a decade to come in, because it will take that long to build the first wind farm, which we have a plot already allocated for, but we will have to go through the whole development of that, including all the planning consent and the community engagement and all the things that we expect other developers to go through. So obviously, we have to invest up front to enable the developer to do that, and we won't have a working wind farm producing its profits back for some time.
So as you heard there, it was largely well received by the different parties. The one concern being, really, why can't it happen sooner? The company's due to be set up by April 2024.
Now, an interesting debate in the Senate about discussing making it become a legal requirement for children in Wales to have a week of residential outdoor activity. How would that work, Teleri?
Yeah, so Sam Rowlands, the Conservative, was picked from the ballot to present this bill. Its aim is to close the gap between Wales's most affluent and least affluent or well-off children. And again, this was largely well received too.
The bill will establish a statutory duty on local authorities to ensure that Wales's young people have the opportunity to participate in a week-long, 4 nights, residential outdoor education visit at some point during their school career. And this we put into practice by ensuring funding is put in place to enable local authorities and schools to deliver these experiences for all our youngsters, which would be, as I say, for at least 1 week, 4 nights at some stage during their school years.
The member's explanatory memorandum estimates the bill for this to be around £10 to £13.6 million. Our early analysis would put it closer to the £18 million mark.
So as you heard there, the Welsh Government have its concerns about the cost, but it was supported by Plaid Cymru, and an abstention by Labour backbencher Jenny Rathbone meant that this passed, which means that Sam Rowlands has just over a year to go and work on it and present the bill back in the Senedd. So to conclude, it felt very much like business as usual here at the Senedd, a productive week, and the tensions of the last few weeks seem, for now at least, to have dissipated.
Thank you very much to Larry Glyn-Jones there in Cardiff. Back to you, Susan. The sensitive issue of language and identity in Northern Ireland was debated in Westminster. What's being proposed?
Well, the aim of this bill is to give a sort of official status to Irish Gaelic in Northern Ireland and to protect the identity of Ulster Scots as well. But there is a huge irony here, because this bill was part of the deal which was meant to help get back to the Assembly sitting in 2020 after a 3-year suspension, and of course it's being discussed now in the middle of another suspension with new elections quite likely. And of course some of those divisions, as you might imagine, were on display in the debate.
The nature of this bill is, of course, to set out to be a good faith implementation of the new decade, new agreement deal. And I genuinely regret that my friends in the DUP have not been able to support this. Some words have been spoken today, which I regret very much. This should be a day of rejoicing for advocates of the Irish language.
This bill rightly aims to create structures and legal protections for the Irish language, Ulster Scots and the Ulster British tradition. Its foundations are based in the Good Friday Agreement's principles of equality and respect.
We cannot support this bill. We cannot support the departure from that which restored devolution just 2 years ago. My right honourable friend, the member for Lagan Valley, indicated that this will be an issue that we as a party will have to revisit again.
This is not, in fact, the Irish Language Act that we would have liked to have seen, but this is a very important step on the way to recognising that the Irish language is a key part of the identity of many people in our community, and that has to be recognised in law.
I appreciate there's still a lot of unease around this, and we have a lot of work in Northern Ireland still to do around reconciliation and building a shared future. But there are many people in Northern Ireland who will warmly welcome the passage of this bill here today.
Now, the government's warned the rail company Avanti, Susan, that it'll intervene if it fails to deliver on significant improvements on the West Coast Main Line. What triggered the warning?
Well, if you've travelled on that West Coast Main Line recently, yes, that's between Glasgow, Manchester and Liverpool, West Midlands and London, you'll know all about the pain of the cancellations. These cancellations were because of a lack of train crews, a lack of staff to run the trains. In August, Avanti decided that one solution to that was to change the timetable and to trim it back. So not so many trains, in fact, quite few trains were actually scheduled to run. So then you couldn't say that there were cancellations if they weren't scheduled to run in the first place. Now, there have been masses of questions about this in the Commons. Lots of MPs, of course, use that train line to get to work at Westminster. So they feel pretty strongly about it. And the Minister did tell them that if Avanti didn't improve soon, could lose its licence to operate, but not quite yet.
On the 7th of October, a short-term contract was entered into with the incumbent operator for the West Coast Partnership. This extends the delivery of the West Coast Partnership Development and Avanti West Coast business for 6 months until the 1st of April 2023. This gives Avanti a clear opportunity to improve its services to the standard we and the public expect. The government will then consider Avanti's performance while finalising a national rail contract for consideration in relation to the route, alongside preparation by the operator of last resort for if it becomes necessary for them to step in at the end of the extension period.
Over the course of their contract, Mr. Speaker, they have had the fewest trains on time, more complaints than any other operator, and a wholesale failure to train new drivers, leading to the mess that we have to endure today. Yet, despite this, they have been rewarded with a contract extension. The Tories, as usual, rewarding failure. A contract extension with gaping holes in the improvement plan announced alongside, prolonging passenger misery.
We're seeing more drivers being trained by Avanti West Coast. We're seeing the plans to reinstate the vast majority of the timetable in December. We will clearly, in terms of the decisions then what come next, want to make sure that that has worked and that is delivering an acceptable level of service for ourselves and for passengers more widely.
Scotland and the north of England have been treated as third-class citizens. I doubt the laissez-faire attitude of the DfT when it comes to industrial relations at Avanti would last 5 minutes if Home Counties commuter services were being slashed in the same way. When are ministers going to roll up their sleeves and get involved?
The idea that this is something that we're not interested in, or there's some sort of laissez-faire attitudes, I'm afraid, completely for the birds.
On Saturday, I endured what was almost a 10-hour odyssey across the UK to go from Barrow to London for an engagement which I then missed. Now, no one's going to peel an onion for me, but many of us have to endure this twice a week. For our constituents, it's many more times than that. They're missing trips to the airport, trips to see their families, they're missing their commutes.
Avanti under fire, Susan. In the House of Lords on a different subject this week, the official status of Prince Andrew and Prince Harry in being allowed to stand in for King Charles for official duties, that was challenged. I suppose most people would have thought that neither prince had any royal role anymore. So what's going on?
Ah, yes. But under the Regency Act of 1937, which I think
I know
you
it
would
well.
know very well, Joe, yes, that says that if the monarch is abroad or can't fulfil his official duties, then either his spouse or the next 4 adults significant, in line of succession, can stand in for him. Now, at the moment, that's Queen Camilla, Prince William, Prince Harry, Prince Andrew and Princess Beatrice. But in the Lords, there were questions about whether Prince Andrew and Prince Harry were really right for the job. And there has been suggestions that maybe the law should be changed to allow Prince Edward or Princess Anne to stand in and deputise for the King if needed.
The House knows that the Regency Act is still very much relevant. It's the only reason it was possible to open the current session of this Parliament. And indeed, when you look at the final year of Her late Majesty's reign, there were elements of a regency about it. Does the noble Lord the Minister not think it is time to approach the King to discuss the potential amendment of this Act, in particular Clause 6, which at the moment defines regents in relation to their line of succession to the Crown? Otherwise, is the government happy to continue with a situation where the councillors of state and regency powers may be exercised by the Duke of York or the Duke of Sussex, one of whom has left public life and one of whom has left the country? So is it not time, my lords, for the government to approach the King and see if a sensible amendment can be made to this Act?
Well, my lords, I thank the noble Viscount for the question, but he will understand, of course, that I am not going to discuss any private conversations with His Majesty or with the royal household. My lords, His Majesty King George VI set out in his gracious message to Parliament that there can be a need to consider contingencies which may hereafter arise and to make such provision as will in any event secure the exercise of royal authority. In that spirit, the government will always consider what arrangements are needed to ensure there is resilience in our constitutional arrangements, and in the past we have seen that the point of accession has proved a useful opportunity to consider the arrangements in place.
Thank you very much, Susan. That's all we have time for in Politics UK this week. I'll be back with you on BBC Two at 12:15 on Monday with Politics Live. Bye-bye.